From our studios on Florida's Gulf Coast, this is Women of Grace Live. Join us today as we discuss issues important to your life and faith. Spiritual insight, compelling discussion, practical wisdom. Women of Grace for such a time as this. Now, here's your host, Johnnette Benkovic.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Women of Grace Live. I am Johnnette Benkovic. What a pleasure it is to be with you today indeed. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. I am so excited today because we have a marvelous guest with us, and this is going to be one of those days where we're not going to be taking phone calls. I know that some of you are with us via YouTube right now, and we will be taking your questions if you send them to us, but we're not going to be taking phone calls today. We are going to be spending as much time as possible with our guest today, who I had the opportunity to interview in January, and she was part of a beautiful live show presentation that took place on January 20th. And I invite you to go out to EWTN. You can watch that program on the YouTube channel that is there for you if you would like to. But we were talking about the reality of what has happened to the women's movement. And our guest has written a book called Subverted, How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement. Her name is Sue Ellen Browder, and she knows intimately well what happened with the wedding between the sexual revolution and the women's movement. And she's going to be sharing with us at great length today about this reality, and she's going to be telling us why it is that we see some of what we see, well, let me put it this way, all of what we see with regard to feminism today. It's a fascinating discovery. It's going to be a fascinating program, and I am really hoping that you will share about this program with your friends. And if they cannot be with us in this moment, they can certainly listen to this broadcast as well as watch that televised presentation of January 20th out there on EWTN's YouTube channel. It is a great pleasure always to have these opportunities to share with you individuals who can help us to understand more deeply and more profoundly the state of affairs that are taking place within our culture. And hopefully, through that exploration together, we can formulate responses that will help for us to get out of the mire that we find ourselves in. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Sue Ellen Browder. We're going to get started. We'll take our soft break when it's time to do that. But for now, let me introduce to you the author of Subverted, How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement, Sue Ellen Browder. Sue Ellen, welcome to Women of Grace Live. It's great to have you with us today.
Oh, it's a great joy to be here. Thank you, Johnnette.
Well, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And, you know, when I had the opportunity to read your book quite some time ago, I became very aware of the fact that this was a topic that more women, more men needed to hear. And it was really, I think, of the Holy Spirit, Sue Ellen, let's see what you think about this, that when we were doing that program, the simulcast on EWTN, on this very topic, it was January the 20th. And no, excuse me, it was January the 19th. Little did I know that this big march on Washington was going to take place the very next day. And it seemed to me that we were giving people information and insight, and they would see the very next day, quite without our realizing it, the full flowering of what we were talking about.
That's right. That Women's March, which was a propaganda campaign extraordinaire.
Wasn't it, though?
That was what many people didn't realize, and even I had a wonderful friend who's very intelligent young college woman in D.C. who went to it, was so excited. She had no idea that the sponsors of that movement were Planned Parenthood and NARAL and the ACLU and people that were promoted, were going to be using those numbers to promote their political agendas.
Yeah, it was really something to behold, and my heart in so many ways broke for the women who were involved in this, because yes. I don't think that they realized that they had fallen for a big lie, and a lie that was carefully orchestrated and propagated. And you can give us some insight into how that is true.
That's correct. Let's start at the beginning. When I used to write for Cosmopolitan magazine, and I was in New York City in 1970-71 when the women's movement and the sexual revolution were in full swing. And what I knew then, and what everybody who was there knew then, was that in those days, the women's movement and the sexual revolution were two radically different movements. I mean, you wouldn't have seen women wearing those hats in a women's movement of the 1970s. But what happened is, behind the scenes, those two movements got joined together. Betty Friedan had called Cosmo was representing the sexual revolution. Betty Friedan, who launched the women's movement with her 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, was fighting for equality for women in education and the workforce. So you had the sexual revolution on one side, the equality for women in the workforce and academia on the other. And Betty Friedan called Cosmo quite obscene and quite horrible. And said that Cosmo and the sexual revolution reduced women to sex symbols and actually denied a woman's full personhood. So how did those two get joined together? Well, that's what I researched for this book, and that's what this book tells.
And I do want to mention, friends, that Sue Ellen's book is available for you out there at EWTNRC.com. That is the website for EWTN's religious catalog. And I would certainly invite you to go out there and to get a copy. It is a very well-written, well-documented book. And it is a book that weds together both the realities, the facts of this coming together of the sexual revolution and the women's movement, in addition to her own personal witness to it and her own personal journey. So it's I'll tell you, Sue Ellen, I told you this when we were doing the program for the simulcast. You know, I just think that it was expertly done, really a testimony to your capacity as an author. And it's a great read, an insightful read, a helpful read. So you can get it at EWTNRC.com. The title again, Subverted, How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement. My guess is if you put Subverted right into the search engine there on the EWTNRC website, it's going to come up. There's not too many books titled Subverted. Right, so I don't think you're going to have trouble finding it. So this, you say, was carefully orchestrated. I want you to tell us how that came about.
Okay, well, Betty Friedan had a very good friend in New York City, a writer friend named Larry Lader. And Larry Lader had gone to Harvard. He was Margaret Sanger's biographer, and Margaret Sanger was the founder of Planned Parenthood.
Yes.
He was a sexual revolutionary, and his greatest passion in life was to make abortion legal, to legalize abortion all over America. And he worked on Betty Friedan for years and years, trying to convince her that abortion and contraception were rights women needed. Larry called pregnancy the ultimate punishment for sex. I mean, really. I mean, he was very anti-child and really anti-woman, right?
Yes.
But Betty Friedan didn't buy it for a long time. And then one night, or one day, Larry Lader was driving along in a car with a man that most people have heard of, a Dr. Bernard Nathanson. Now, Dr. Nathanson was an abortionist who later saw a baby on a fetal monitor and became pro-life.
Yes.
And he claimed responsibility for 70,000 abortions before he became pro-life. So in many ways, Bernard Nathanson followed the path that I have, because I was very pro-abortion when I was writing for Cosmopolitan, and now I'm a pro-life Catholic, and even spoke at the March for Life last year. So there's that flip when you finally find the truth, then you become very pro-life. But anyway, so Larry Lader told Dr. Nathanson, that they had to recruit the feminists if they wanted their abortion campaign to work. And we don't know exactly what he said to Betty, because he'd been working on her for years. But 6 weeks later, she stood up at the National Organization for Women's meeting and rammed through the abortion vote. There were 8 rights voted on that night, and there were only 2 that they fought over. Most of these things were very unifying. Every woman wanted equal pay for equal work. They wanted equal educational opportunities in college. They wanted all of these things. But the two things they fought over were, one, the Equal Rights Amendment. And why did they fight over the Equal Rights Amendment? Because one woman who walked out that night, who was a very, very big in the civil rights movement, a black attorney, said human rights are indivisible. Women's rights are already covered in the Constitution. We don't need a separate constitutional amendment for it. And so we've still got people pushing for that today. We don't need that. Human rights are indivisible. The other right they fought over that night, fiercely, was the abortion right, which Betty Friedan rammed through, and a lot of people who were there thought that a number of students had shown up just to ram through the abortion vote. And when the dust finally settled, only 57 people out of about 100 that had been there originally, but only 57 people voted to put abortion into the women's movement. And when that happened, you see, this was one of the sexual revolution's most fervent demands. When that happened, suddenly the media and the public began to see the sexual revolution and the women's movement as one and the same.
Yes.
Women, in fact, the Washington Post reported the next day, or the next Monday morning, this happened on the Saturday night in the Chinese room of the Mayflower Hotel on November 18th, 1967 in Washington, D.C. I found the exact date.
And it was no easy thing to find, was it?
It wasn't. It took me a long time to find that date. For a long time, I knew it was in November of 67, but it took me, I worked on this, researched this for 4 years, and I finally found it in the papers of the National Organization for Women, housed in the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe University. And these are private papers that you have to get permission to get into, and the National Organization for Women gave me permission.
And that was amazing in and of itself. I mean, it's clear to me that when you were working on this book and the publication of this book, the timing of it all was certainly of the Holy Spirit, because we need this information. And if you would like to get a copy of the book, we're getting some questions out here on YouTube. Individuals asking, repeat the title of the book. It is Subverted: How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement. You can purchase this at EWTN's Religious Catalog, and you can go out there to EWTNRC.com. That's EWTNRC.com. I'm holding it up for the benefit of all of you that are with us by YouTube there, so that you can get a look at the cover of it, and you'll recognize it when you see it. A marvelous book, as I say, because not only does it give us these facts, but it ties it into Sue Ellen's personal journey. Now, it's an interesting thing, because one of the little points that I read in your book about the way in which these movements begin to gain legs and begin to become pervasive, as this has happened, does not necessarily demand a large number of people initially. In most cases, it's a small number of people that are able to forward this. And this is the way that all propaganda and all, what would we say, activist movements and even anarchies happen. Can you share with us a little bit about that, Sue?
Well, that is exactly the thing. It doesn't start with something big. It starts with something little. And we must remember that as we try to promote the truth. Yes. In our lives, that it doesn't have to be a big thing. This book, for example, started with 3 people. And we all talked about it, and we said, okay, what are we going to do here? And then another one joined us, and there were 4 of us. And that's how this book began. Everything starts with a small little seed and builds from there. And that's what happened with this propaganda campaign. But one thing that they had that we did not do, because we were not trying to fabricate the truth, they had lots of propaganda tools at their disposal. Larry Lader was very, very brilliant man, and he knew how propaganda worked, and he knew how to take their ideas and sell them to the American public, and that's exactly what he did. And he said every revolution, and that his revolution was abortion, has to have a villain. He says, it doesn't matter whether it's a king, a dictator, or a czar, but it has to be someone, a person, to rebel against. And so who do you think his favorite whipping boy was. Who did he go after? Who was his villain? The Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't just the Catholic Church, because he knew, of course, that the Catholic Church would be the greatest opposer to his abortion agenda. But he said it couldn't be the entire Catholic Church, because there might be a group of liberal Catholics who would stay with them on their side. So he said we have to vilify the Catholic hierarchy, because people won't know exactly who that is, but it sounds very, nefarious to a lot of people, because of course there's a lot of anti-Catholicism in this country.
That's right.
And so he said the Catholic hierarchy is the real enemy. He called the Catholic hierarchy the biggest single obstacle to peace and decency throughout all of history.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, because when you tell us this, Sue Ellen, I'm so reminded of the fact that no matter what kind of message that is going to be delivered that has a stance against the human person, the first obstacle that is recognized and gone after is the Catholic Church. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it is the gay activist movement. It doesn't matter if it's the radical feminist movement, which is what I would call this. It doesn't it doesn't matter if it's socialism or communism. It's the Catholic Church that is the first to come under attack.
That's right. That's right. Because in the end, that is the greatest threat to tyrants.
Mm-hmm.
The Catholic Church is the greatest threat to tyrants, and is the greatest threat to lies, to the father of lies.
Yeah.
So who do they come after? They come after the Catholic Church. And Bernie Nathanson, who was an honest man, because he did switch sides eventually, he said to Larry, he says, but isn't the Catholic hierarchy really identifiable with all these anti-abortion forces? He says, aren't there any other people against abortion? And Larry said, no. That's the way he saw the Catholic Church was the enemy, and he was going to vilify it. And he did a very, very excellent job of doing that, until even people within the Catholic Church believed that abortion was a good thing. And it did a lot of damage to the church, especially the whole abortion contraception thing in the 60s. Yeah.
Tremendously so. We do have a question out here that did come to us, and I want to get to this question. This is one that we've got by message, actually. And this individual says, when did feminism seemingly become exclusively about abortion and contraception? And coupled with this question, how would the suffragettes respond to the feminist movement today?
Well, the suffragettes, first of all, would not like it at all, because they were all pro-life, and they did not embrace a sexual revolution. They didn't even have one then. So how did that? When did the feminist movement become so sexualized? Well, once that abortion right was inserted in the women's movement, in the National Organization for Women's Bill of Rights, one group, the pro-life group, who would have followed the suffragists, broke off and formed a whole new organization. And they went ahead and continued to fight for the freedoms that they were originally going to seek,
Yes.
The other group, the National Organization for Women, went off into the sexual revolution. So it happened. The moment it happened was that night in the Chinese Room, shortly before midnight on November 18th, 1967, when 1/3 of those feminists walked out over the abortion vote and later resigned from the National Organization for Women and went on to found a what we would call a more conservative, but really a more pro-life organization that would fight for women's freedoms. In the meantime, the National Organization for Women, which had all the attention of the media, had gone into the sexual revolution part of the movement. And they broke off. They became very interested in gender rights, lesbian rights, abortion, reproductive rights. All of that stuff was carried away from that meeting through the National Organization for Women.
Yeah.
And then the National Organization for Women didn't even have attorneys on staff for many years. It was this other organization that fought for women's rights to not be fired for being pregnant, helped open up the academia, got rid of help-wanted female and help-wanted male ads. It was the pro-life feminists that actually won all those victories, but it was the pro-abortion feminists that took all the credit. Now, how did that happen? Well, two reasons. Number one, the media, the pro-abortion feminists had the media's ear. The other thing is that the pro-life feminists had jobs. They didn't want their bosses to know they were out marching in the streets and fighting for all of these freedoms. They didn't want to be fired. And so they said, well, let the National Organization for Women have it. Let them have all the attention. Well, of course, now we've got today where we think they're the only feminists that exist. And that's not true.
Well, that is not true. Interestingly, when we think back to that march that took place on January 21st, and it was definitely January 20th that you were with us on the simulcast, when we think back to that march that took place on January 21st, we're very well aware of the fact that those women who organized that march or the powers that be that advanced it were very quick to say all women were invited except those who are pro-life.
Right.
So what we see here is this, not just there was a breach that occurred back in 1967, but now what we have is a complete, what would I say, total turning the back on the fact that you can be in favor of that which should be part of a woman's right as a citizen of a nation, a country, because she is equal to man, just not the same as man.
Right.
And she should get equal pay for equal work. All of these things should be in place for her. But now it's really simply boiled down to this one issue, abortion and contraception.
It has, because that was the right number 8. That is the only right that they fought over that night, and we're still fighting over today. Mm-hmm. And so women are still fighting over that right, and the people who call themselves feminists, that's become a dirty word in a lot of people's minds. They don't even want to be called feminists. The people who call themselves feminists are the ones who are really promoting the sexual revolution. Mm-hmm. They don't know it, though, because you're right. I mean, these young women have grown up in this world. They don't know. They don't know what happened back then. Nobody did until I dug it out. Because
it's an interesting thing to me because here's, Sue Ellen, and the comment that you're alluding to is one that I made prior to us going on the air, and I was saying, you and I have the benefit of age. We can look back and remember that time, and we remember it differently. At that time, I was just a year or so, I think, behind you, but I was just finishing up one part of my educational career. You were already in your career field. You were a journalist. You were part of all of this going on at that time from that perspective. And I was in the part where the whole boat was rocking, for me, where there was just this big change in mores and understanding of what was right, what was wrong. Everything was up for grabs and everything was changing very quickly. These individuals, the women that were out there that were petitioning for abortion and contraception, were on the fringe. At least they were on the cultural fringe in terms of the cultural mindset at that time. But now that has moved center stage. It is now mainstream to think in this direction. So you're very right. Our young women have grown up in this soup, so to speak.
Right.
And it's become it's become the way in which they operate and think, and it's been implemented within our schools. We're going to go to a quick break here, and when we come back, we're going to continue our discussion today, friends. Again, our guest is Sue Ellen Browder. She is the author of Subverted, How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement, a book that is a must-read for you. And certainly, If you are a parent and you have daughters who are high school age or older, this is a book that you should get for them and read with them and explain to them. Not because the information is difficult to digest, but because what's being expressed here will take your maternal guidance to walk them through. A great book to discuss with them. Available for you at EWTN's Religious Catalog. The website address for that religious catalog is EWTNRC.com. I invite you to get out there and to order a copy. We're going to be right back with our guest, Sue Ellen Browder. This is Women of Grace Live. I'm Johnnette Benkovic. Stay with us.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
So many feminists who want to be equal absolutely degrading themselves. That you want to be a priest, you want to be this, you want to be that, you want to be equal, and yet the media degrades your nature, your beauty as a woman, your goodness. What are you doing to your soul? Huh? What are you doing? Do you know what you're doing? You're taking a beautiful body, a beautiful soul, and you're degrading it into the dust. Let us pray. At some point, our dear Lord touches their hearts.
St. Francis of Assisi said, "While you are proclaiming peace with your lips, be careful to have it even more fully in your heart." Let us reflect. What has the potential of robbing me of my peace today? What can I do to overcome this temptation?
If you'd like to receive a daily Grace Line by email, go to womenofgrace.com and click on the word Grace Line, and then check the box Receive Grace Lines. That's womenofgrace.com.
This is Johnnette Benkovic, host of Women of Grace.
Hello, this is Cardinal Donald Wuerl of the Archdiocese of Washington.
This is Gloria Purvis, host of Morning Glory. Thanks for listening to the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Welcome back, friends. You're listening to Women of Grace Live. I am Johnnette Benkovic. We are delighted to have with us today our guest, Sue Ellen Browder. She is the author of Subverted: How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement. This book is available for you at EWTN's Religious Catalog. The website address is EWTNRC.com. That is EWTNRC.com. If you prefer to call to order the copy of the book, 1-800-854-6316. Again, 800-854-6316. You can call that way and speak with a customer service rep to put in your order. I don't care if you go to the website and order it, and I don't care if you call and order it. Just order it, because it's a book you ought to read. It was very eye-opening for me, very helpful for me to put into perspective everything that we have been seeing within our culture and what continues to move this culture forward in the direction of pro-death. It was very, very insightful. Sue Ellen has done extremely careful research and documentation in this book, and yet managed to make this, dare I say it, an easy read. She also tells us her personal story in the midst of it, and we're going to be talking about that right now. So I do want you, Sue Ellen, to share with us a little bit. You know, you say that you helped to subvert the women's movement. You helped to subvert it by participating in this sexual revolution. In what way did you do that?
Right. Well, you have to understand how propaganda works. Because
Okay.
I say I was a sex revolution propagandist for Cosmopolitan, because we were making up a lot of those stories. Those stories about those women living these wonderful sexually free lives, they weren't real. We made them up, because in those days, the sexual revolution was just beginning to go into full swing, and there weren't that many women around who were jumping into bed with men on their first dates, or there weren't that many women who were having sex outside their marriage. There weren't that many women, so those stories were made up. And that wasn't just me. It was a really kind of a policy of Helen Gurley Brown, who was the editor of Cosmo. She had been old copywriter, advertising copywriter, and she had no qualms about making up things to sell stuff to people. Okay? So I wanted to explain to you how propaganda works. So there was a man, named Edward Bernays in the 1920s. He was Freud's nephew, and he wrote a book called Propaganda. He was one of the first public relations men to tell people how propaganda works. And he said, how do you sell a piano to the middle class? You know, because a piano is a pretty high-ticket item. How do you get people in the middle class to want to buy a piano? Well, you do it by selling the music room. You have all these beautiful houses and Architectural Digest and all of these magazines where the rich and the successful and the famous have these lovely music rooms. Yeah. And once you convince the middle class that they need a music room, they will just naturally say, I need a piano.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, here we are. We hear that music. We're going to go to our hard break. When we come back, more on how propaganda moves a culture with our guest, Sue Ellen Browder. She is an award-winning investigative journalist. She is the author of the book Subverted, How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement. It is available for you at EWTNRC.com. That is the website for EWTN's religious catalog. You're listening to Women of Grace Live. I'm Johnnette Benkovic. We're going to be right back. Stay with us.
When Pope John Paul II landed in Washington, D.C. and was greeted by then President Reagan, the president said, "Welcome to the land of the free." And John Paul II said, "Free, yes, but free for what? Free for what?" It seems today that we define freedom as the ability to do whatever you want. Of course, doing whatever we feel like doing in the moral realm doesn't necessarily lead to freedom, but often leads to vice. Vice. That's the perfect word for it. It's a destructive habit that grabs us kind of like a vice grip and doesn't let us go very easily. Don't believe me? Think of your favorite sin. Now try to stop. Genesis 4:7 says, "Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control you, but you must subdue it and become its master." You see, freedom isn't the ability to do whatever we want. It's the power to do what's right. And ultimately, true freedom is the power to love. That's the kind of freedom Jesus Christ modeled for us in his life and in his death. And it's the kind of freedom he's inviting us to live in today. I'm Chris Stefanik from reallifecatholic.com.
Hello, friends. If there was a program that could help your daughter, granddaughter, niece, or student to come to realize the gift of her femininity and the beautiful reality of who she is in the eyes of God, would you be interested in having her participate? Would you be interested in helping her and other young women to participate in it? I hope the answer is yes, because that program is now available for young women. Women of Grace is delighted to launch our newest Women of Grace study program, Young Women of Grace, Embrace Your Femininity. This beautiful study for girls ages 12 through 17 teaches young women what it means to be a daughter of God, to discern their purpose and mission in the world, and to find true fulfillment without losing their souls. Young Women of Grace presents vital Catholic teaching in a colorful magazine-style workbook that is packed with fun facts, testimonials, and stories of the saints and other Catholic role models. Transform the life of that special young woman and order a copy today. Visit womenofgrace.com or call 800-558-5452. That's womenofgrace.com.
As an EWTN media missionary, your task is to prayerfully take EWTN to your parish and community through the print and electronic media we provide. Visit EWTNmissionaries.com today and join us in sharing the eternal word with the world.
Hello, this is Bishop Robert Baker from the Diocese of Birmingham in Alabama.
I'm Peggy Normandin, but you can call me Catholic.
Hello, friends. This is Father Wade Menezes of the Fathers of Mercy. Thanks for listening to the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Welcome back, friends. You're listening to Women of Grace Live. I'm Johnnette Benkovic. Very happy to be with you today and delighted to be able to present to you our guest, Sue Ellen Browder. She is author of the book Subverted, How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement. It's available for you out there at EWTN's Religious Catalog's website, and that's EWTNRC.com. You can also order a copy by phone if you feel more comfortable that way, talking with a customer service representative. The number is 800-854-6316. That is the number for EWTN's Religious Catalog. We are not taking any phone calls today. However, some of you are with us by EWTN Radio's YouTube channel, and we're happy to get your questions up here so that we can address them to our guest, Sue Ellen. Sue Ellen, when we went to the break, you were sharing with us about propaganda, and you were telling us that in order for us to understand what your participation was in helping to hijack the women's movement through the sexual revolution, we needed to understand that. And what I find so intriguing about your story is this. The fact is, as you were sharing with us about Cosmo, very few women at that point in time, I'm certainly sure that there was a very slight percentage of the population, as opposed to a large percentage of the population of women, who were living this sexually free lifestyle. And by that I mean who were participating in extramarital and premarital sexual relations on a recurring basis, oftentimes with various partners.
Right.
The way that it was phrased in Cosmo, though, made it seem as though everybody was doing this. And
everybody
you're telling us
having fun. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And you're telling us that all of those stories were manufactured. So somebody was reading Cosmo thinking that these were actual stories, but it was all fictitious.
It was all fictitious, and it was all designed to make you buy something, to sell you something. Mm-hmm. So what I told you in the last segment is that you sell pianos by selling the music room. And how do you sell beautiful clothes, glamorous makeup, hair salon stuff, all beautiful, everything, trips to Europe, all of this stuff? You sell it by selling the Cosmo lifestyle. Mm-hmm. If you sell the Cosmo lifestyle and a woman buys into this, she's just naturally going to have to be on the pill. She's going to have an abortion when the pill fails her. She's going to have all this stuff that the advertisers in Cosmo want you to buy.
Yeah.
So
well, in addition to selling consumer items like that, there was also a big agenda that was being sold.
Yes, exactly. The sexual revolution was a big agenda. Again, though, Helen Gurley Brown was doing this because she wanted fame, money, and power, and pleasure, and it gave her all those things. She got that, but when she was 72 years old, she told Psychology Today, it's no fun to wake up scared every morning. This is the result of this Cosmo lifestyle down the road. And young women don't realize it. It sounds so much fun when you're 18. But how does it play out over the whole life as this interior life of yours deteriorates, and all you have left is stuff out there?
Yeah.
And that it didn't pan out for Helen Gurley Brown. Really coined that phrase, having it all, but she never had children.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about that, and I think that you make a very good point here, and I think that this is one of the reasons why in our young people today we find so many young women especially, although young men this applies to as well, who are so disenchanted. There's almost a type of nihilistic perspective that's taken hold and grabbed their hearts, a hopelessness. So many find themselves trying to medicate that in very unhealthy ways. They medicate it by continuing to do what they've been doing, thinking that they're going to get a different result, which is the definition of insanity. They medicate themselves through drugs, through alcohol, through eating disorders, all to try to assuage this pain that's in their heart that's caused because they're living out of they're not living within the context of the integrity of the human person.
They're living a sexual fantasy.
That's right.
And that's what Cosmo is selling, and that's what all the young women's magazines are selling today, because Cosmo worked so well. You see it now in Glamour, you see it in Self, you see it in Elle. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
On television.
Absolutely. Now, when Larry Lader and Bernard Nathanson were driving in this car, it's hard for us to really envision the fact that so many of these cultural movements, so many of the way in which these activist movements get started are in these very mundane, ordinary ways, such as driving in a car. But when they were in that car, Larry Lader had Bernard Nathanson's ear. And so he began to lay out his strategy for how he was going to move this thing forward.
That's right. He told him, he says, we've got to keep the women out front. you know what I mean, he says, and some blacks, black women especially. Why are they so damn slow to see the importance of this whole movement to themselves? Now, this is verbatim what we would not know this conversation actually occurred if Bernard Nathanson hadn't told us. So everything that I'm telling you here is recorded on paper. When we're an investigative reporter, you have to follow the paper trail. You've got to know exactly where this came from. So that's what he says. It apparently didn't cross his mind that black women didn't think his crusade to eliminate their babies was freeing for them.
Yeah.
So they did. They got Shirley Chisholm to be one of the first now presidents, and she was a black congresswoman.
You know, it's interesting to me because basically what you're really talking about is the manipulation of women, and these women who are out there marching around with what can I say?
Pink hats.
Yes, pink hats. Yes, these women that are out there and they're marching around. Really demeaning themselves, and demeaning the reality of who they are as God's daughters, demeaning the reality of their true femininity. Making fools of themselves, if you will.
Really? Yes. Yes, really.
What they don't realize is they've been all manipulated to believe a certain way. They've all been manipulated to act like, individuals who are partially out of their minds.
Well, propaganda is designed to make you take action. If somebody just believes something and doesn't do anything about it, then propaganda has been worthless. You have to buy something. You have to march in a march. You have to do something that the propagandist wants you to do. If you just sit there and say, "Oh, I kind of believe that," it's not going to be what the propagandist wants. Yeah, you actually have to do something.
One of the lies that I think the women's movement has perpetuated, and maybe this happened also in the China room of the the Mayflower Hotel, the Mayfair.
Right.
The Mayflower Hotel in 1967. Maybe it happened there, I don't know. But one of the lies that has been perpetuated is that if a woman is going to be equal to a man, then she has got to in some way masculinize herself.
Well, that was implied. You know, that when it came out of that room that night, that was implicit in their Bill of Rights, wasn't it? If you have to imagine, you have to take away your femininity. You have to either be on the pill, or if you if the pill fails you, you have to have an abortion. You have to have a body like a man to make it in a man's world. That was the error. And even Betty Friedan later said that she never really believed that abortion she never really believed in abortion. And she said she always believed that the right of choice was a woman's right to have a child. That she said that's as important as any right in the Constitution. So even though Betty Friedan was conned, if you will, by this Larry Lader into inserting abortion into the women's movement, she later came to say that was a big mistake, and she said the women's movement had come to a dead end, and she said our blind spot was the family.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, that, of course, this whole notion of you must be the same to be equal. So you sterilize your womb, and you do that either through surgery or you do that through poisoning it through contraception. Right. This whole concept that if you're going to make it in a man's world, you've got to somehow restructure the way in which you are naturally created to be, even down to your thinking processes, so that you now think like a man, act like a man, function like a man. It flies in the face of what our church teaching gives to us in the whole concept of complementarity. And we have a YouTube comment here. Why is the concept of complementarity offensive these days? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think we've been sold a bill of goods. The only way the only path to freedom or the best path to freedom, I was happily married, is when a man and a woman work together as a team.
Yes.
You know, I was happily married for 40 years. Beautiful, beautiful marriage. And that set me free. That didn't put me in chains because we were different. We belonged together.
Mm-hmm. Here's a text question that's come in. Where can I find a conclusive source or study guide about the Church's teachings on men and women? And of course, I would recommend that everybody look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church. You're going to get a very, very good perspective from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Right. If you want more study, then I would look toward St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body. Probably in our day and time, the most comprehensive gift that we've been given on this topic about the complementarity of men and women, and the equality that each has, the authority that each has, equal but not the same. And it's this concept of sameness, I think, that is tripping us up every single time.
I agree.
So let's move forward here a little bit more. Share with us how it was in your own personal journey then, Sue Ellen, that you began to see the truth and the reality of what was taking place, and you began to back away from it.
Well, I began to raise my 2 children. I had children. I had a beautiful marriage. I was living out in the country in Connecticut, baking homemade breads and chocolate chip cookies, and having a wonderful life. But I was still writing this sex revolution propaganda for Cosmo to make a living. But gradually, it began to eat at me, and I didn't know what was eating at me. Again, it's like you say, people try to fill up that emptiness inside with something, and they don't know what. Mm-hmm. I was just very, very anxious and depressed. At the same time I was living this good life, at the same time this kind of anxiety and depression was eating at me, and it was because I was using my talents to lie to people. Mm-hmm. But and when I finally gave that up, and I did actually have kind of quite a little, it's in the book, quite a little fight with Helen Gurley Brown over it, because I decided she wasn't paying me enough money. That's why, it wasn't a noble reason I quit. I quit because I didn't think she was paying me enough. But once I did quit that, the next magazine I started writing for was the Reader's Digest. And slowly that anxiety and depression began to go away. But it wasn't until I came into the beautiful Catholic Church and found the fullness of the truth in the Church. I had no idea it was here, and it was that catechism I read. It was so beautiful. When I started reading the catechism, I couldn't put it down. I read it for 3 days straight. This was everything I'd been looking for in my life, and I didn't know it was in the Catholic Church. It was the last place I would have looked. And it was the last place I looked.
Well, I'm going to tell you that the reality is there's that beautiful passage in sacred scriptures that tells us that the truth will set you free. And it was the truth that absolutely set you free. And just share with us a little bit of how that journey took place. How did you move from point A to point B? How did you come into the church?
Well, it was a slow thing. We went back to, we're Episcopalians, and we went back to church when our kids were about 7 and 10, because I realized I'd given them no religious education at all. Mm-hmm. And then we fell away from the church again, and then my daughter came home from college, and we had moved again. As people will see in this book, we moved.
Yes,
and we went to another Episcopal church because I wanted her to have friends when she came home from college. It didn't take with her, but it did with me. And I began to go to church. I began to feel better. I began to find God. I began to search for God. I began to read Thomas Merton. And then we moved again. And the Episcopal church where we moved was not working too well. Let's put it that way. And my husband said, why don't we look at the Catholic Church? And I said, I'm not going to join that patriarchal old church. Now, of course, I've been a Catholic for 13 years. I live next door to my priest. I water his orchids when he goes out of town. I'm the church office in my...
You're the church lady.
Catholicism.
You are the church lady. Sue Ellen Browder, church lady. Well, we do have a very serious question here, and I think that this is probably going to take us pretty close to the end of our time together today. But Jose is with us in Venezuela, and he's with us via EWTN Radio's YouTube channel. And he says that he rejects abortion except in case of incest because he feels he should not affect the raped woman any further. And he says, how do you reconcile rejecting abortion even in the case of incest? And do you want to forward an answer on that, Sue Ellen?
That's a very hard question. Of course, the baby isn't responsible for that crime. The baby is innocent. So once again, you're taking an innocent life. But those are the hard questions, and these are very rare compared to most abortions out there. But those are hard questions that are hard for me. I'd like for you to hear what you say, Johnnette.
Okay. Well, this is what I would say to you, Jose. I first of all, I appreciate your compassion for women who have found themselves in these very, very difficult circumstances, conceiving a child through rape or incest. I understand the desire of your heart is to offer them an opportunity for healing and hope. The fact of the matter is, abortion never brings healing and hope. It certainly doesn't bring healing and hope for the child who is killed in the womb of his or her mother. And it is another attack against the woman because women are deeply affected by abortion emotionally and psychologically. Sometimes they are affected physically. I know more than one woman who had an abortion, and it was the only pregnancy that she would know because she was unable to conceive after that. So what's happening is you're taking a woman who has been victimized, and now you're victimizing her yet again. And we don't want to do that. What we want to do is be compassionate toward her. What we want to do is to hold her hand through this. What we want to do is reassure her. What we want to do is make provision for her. What we want to do is to help her heal from the one victimization without victimizing her yet again and complicating that which has happened to her already. There is always an effect. A lot of women, Sue Ellen, don't recognize the effects of abortion. But very frequently, these women will assign it to something else. But you've mentioned some things that are the result and condition of the promiscuous lifestyle that Cosmo has promoted and that many women have purchased hook, line, and sinker, and that has been promulgated, really, through the media and even through our school systems. And that is that when we live outside of truth, we are depressed, we are sad, we self-medicate, and we are often self-destructive by the other choices that we make. So, Jose, I admire your compassion, but it needs to be brought into right order. We don't want to misapply compassion or read compassion as something that it is not.
That's an excellent answer because I had an abortion again while I was living this fantasy world that I was living in Cosmo, and Roe v. Wade had just been decided. I had an abortion the year afterwards. Walter and I aborted our third child, and that has tormented me. And it tormented me for years. It still bothers me, but the Catholic Church healed that for me through God's forgiveness.
Well, Sue Ellen, thank you so much for being so very candid with that. And, so many times people will say, well, the only reason why a woman feels guilty about that is because the Catholic Church heaps guilt on her. And if the Catholic Church kept her mouth shut, then this woman wouldn't feel these things. But that is not the case, is it?
No, it's not. As a matter of fact, we know that human rights are indivisible, that child is part of us, and we are part of that child. And when we lose that child, you've actually lost a child. And every woman knows it. And again, when you talk about all that medication, the alcohol, the drugs, the eating disorders, those often happen after an abortion. So again, what you're saying is, if that woman is raped or is pregnant by incest, are you really going to traumatize her twice?
That's
that was
right.
an excellent answer, and it's right on.
Well, thank you so very much. And I want to remind everybody again that Sue Ellen's book is available for you out there at EWTN's Religious Catalog. That's EWTNRC.com. That is the way that you can get a copy of her book via the website. If you would prefer to call and speak with a customer service representative, you can do that too. That number is 800-854-6316. I do want to remind you that the live simulcast television radio program that we produced with Sue Ellen on January the 20th is available for you out there at EWTN's YouTube channel. So I encourage you to go and to watch that. It's also available for you on our Women of Grace website, womenofgrace.com. We certainly do want to encourage you to learn more about the roots of the sexual revolution and the women's movement and the marriage between the two, so that you can be set free and make choices that are in accordance with the laws of God, because it is by living that you will experience true freedom. Sue Ellen, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you, Johnnette. It was wonderful.
Thank you. And we'll do it again sometime, too. And friends, we do want to remind you that we'll be back with you again, so stay listening for Women of Grace Live.